On the morning of March 29, 2017, in the industrial city of Rajshahi, Bangladesh, a medical student named Raa Atif prepared breakfast in her dormitory room. She chopped vegetables, set a frying pan on the stove, and made her bed with the kind of precision that suggested routine, not finality. By noon, she was dead. Her roommate found her hanging from a chandelier, a scarf knotted around her neck. Police declared it self-harm within hours. Yet every detail in that room, the untouched food, the locked door, the absence of a note, whispered a different story, one investigators chose not to hear. What began as a tragedy in a quiet college would spiral into a case that exposed how quickly truth can be buried when it threatens the comfortable narratives people in power prefer to maintain. This is the story of a young woman who came from the Maldives to study medicine, who became famous for her ocean blue eyes, and who died under circumstances no one in authority was willing to fully explain. Before we go deeper, subscribe if you love true crime documentaries, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Raa Atif was born in the Maldives, a small island nation in the Indian Ocean where her family lived a quiet, middle-class life. Her father, Muhammad Atif, worked as a physician, and her mother, Aminath, devoted herself to raising their daughter. When Raa turned 8, the family made a decision that would shape her worldview in ways they could not have anticipated. They relocated to Bhopal, a city in central India known for two things: its history as a center of Islamic culture and its lingering trauma from one of the worst industrial disasters in modern history. In 1984, a toxic gas leak at the Union Carbide pesticide plant in Bhopal killed thousands of people overnight. Estimates vary, but some reports suggest as many as 15,000 died in the immediate aftermath, with many more succumbing to long-term health complications in the years that followed. By the time the Atif family arrived 2 decades later, the city still bore the scars of that catastrophe. Muhammad Atif worked in a local hospital where many patients suffered from chronic illnesses linked to the disaster: respiratory conditions, neurological disorders, cancers that appeared decades after exposure. The air in Bhopal carried a kind of invisible history, a reminder that human negligence could turn an ordinary night into a mass grave. Raa grew up surrounded by conversations about illness, death, and the fragility of life. In a city where mortality was never abstract, where children her age might know someone who had lost a parent or grandparent to the gas leak's aftermath, she developed an acute awareness of human vulnerability. It was in that environment, according to those who knew her, that she first expressed interest in medicine. Not as a career chosen for status or financial security, but as a way to respond to suffering she had seen firsthand. The family spent several years in Bhopal before returning to the Maldives, when Raa was still in her early teens. But the city left a mark on her. Friends who knew her later would recall that she spoke about Bhopal with a kind of reverence, not for the place itself, but for what it represented: a lesson in resilience and a reminder of what happens when institutions fail to protect people. That lesson would take on a darker meaning years later, when institutions failed her in a different way. Back in the Maldives, Raa adjusted to life in a small, tightly knit community where everyone knew everyone, and privacy was a foreign concept. She attended local schools, excelled academically, and was known for being thoughtful and reserved. But something else set her apart, and it had nothing to do with her intentions or her character. Raa was strikingly beautiful, with fair skin unusual for the region, and eyes that seemed to shift between blue and grey depending on the light. In a society where modesty and blending in were prized, her appearance made her conspicuous, whether she wanted it to be or not. When she was 14, she participated in a televised environmental campaign aimed at raising awareness about ocean conservation. It was a local initiative, not particularly high profile, but a photographer noticed her and suggested a photo shoot by the beach. Raa agreed, partly out of curiosity and partly because the photographer offered to pay her a small fee. The session produced several images, but one in particular went viral. It showed Raa standing waist-deep in the Indian Ocean, her gaze steady and unflinching as she looked directly into the camera. The photograph spread across social media platforms within days. People started calling her the girl with ocean eyes. Modeling agencies from across South Asia began reaching out, offering contracts and promising opportunities in fashion capitals like Mumbai and Colombo. Practically overnight, Raa became a minor celebrity, her image circulating on blogs and Instagram pages devoted to South Asian beauty. But for Raa, the attention was uncomfortable. She had not sought fame, and she did not want it. She gave a few interviews, mostly because journalists kept requesting them, and in those conversations she made one thing clear: modeling was not her passion. It was a way to earn money, nothing more. Her real ambition was to become a physician like her father, someone who could provide care to people who could not afford it. She continued doing occasional modeling work, but only on her own terms, and only when it did not interfere with her studies. Those who worked with her during that period described her as professional but distant, someone who showed up, did the job, and left without lingering for small talk. She was not rude, they said, but she seemed to occupy a different mental space, as if she were already imagining a future where none of this mattered. By the time Raa graduated from secondary school, she had saved enough money from modeling to cover part of her college expenses. She applied to several medical programs in South Asia and was accepted at a private Islamic medical college in Rajshahi, Bangladesh. The institution offered her a scholarship, which was one of the main reasons she chose it. But there was another reason, one she did not articulate publicly. Studying abroad meant independence, a chance to live away from the scrutiny of her small island community, where everyone knew her face and everyone had an opinion about how she should live. Her parents supported the decision, though her mother later admitted she had reservations. Bangladesh was culturally conservative, especially outside the capital, and Rajshahi was a smaller city where traditional values held more sway than they did in places like Dhaka. Aminath worried that her daughter's beauty, combined with her independent streak, might attract the wrong kind of attention, but Raa was determined, and in 2016, at the age of 19, she moved to Rajshahi to begin her medical studies. The college she enrolled in was a private institution with a religious foundation. It enforced strict behavioral codes, particularly for female students. Women were required to wear hijabs on campus and to live in a separate dormitory under the supervision of college staff. The dormitory was located within the college grounds, a measure the administration described as protective, though critics argued it was more about control than safety. Students were not supposed to leave the dormitory after dark without permission, and male visitors were strictly prohibited. The college's code of conduct was explicit about modesty, piety, and the importance of upholding Islamic values. Any deviation from these norms was seen as disrespectful, not just to the institution but to the community as a whole. Raa tried her best to adapt. She wore the hijab when required, followed the dormitory curfew, and kept a low profile. But adaptation is not always enough when the rules are designed to police not just behavior, but identity itself. Raa's appearance, her modeling background, and her financial independence made her an anomaly in an environment where conformity was expected. Some students admired her for managing to support herself, but others saw her independence as arrogance. Rumors began to circulate almost immediately. People whispered that she did not wear her hijab properly, that she had been seen without it off campus, that she accepted modeling assignments even while studying. In a small insular community, these whispers gained momentum quickly. They were not necessarily based on fact, but they did not need to be. Perception mattered more than truth. Raa's roommate during her first year was a student named Sirat Parveen Mahmood. The two lived in the same dormitory room, shared the same space, and attended some of the same classes. By most accounts, they were cordial but not close. Raa was reserved, and Sirat, according to those who knew her, was more socially active, someone who moved easily within the dormitory's social networks. It is unclear whether the two had any serious conflicts, but later events would raise questions about the nature of their relationship. Raa continued to do occasional modeling work during her time in Rajshahi, partly to pay for her living expenses, and partly because she had contractual obligations from before she moved. She posted some of these photos on social media, which only fueled the rumors. In an environment where a woman's reputation could be damaged by the smallest perceived transgression, posting photographs online, even professional, fully clothed images, was seen by some as provocative. Students began confronting her, telling her she needed to act more appropriately. On the street, strangers shouted at her, instructing her to cover herself properly. Raa did not respond publicly to these incidents, but friends who stayed in touch with her later said she found the hostility exhausting. She had come to Rajshahi to study medicine, not to defend her right to exist on her own terms. By early 2017, Raa had been living in Rajshahi for about a year. Academically, she was doing well. Her professors described her as diligent and focused, someone who took her studies seriously and showed promise as a future physician. But socially, she was increasingly isolated. She spent more time alone in her dormitory room, avoiding the common areas where other students gathered. She continued to stay in touch with her parents through phone calls and messaging apps, though she rarely mentioned the difficulties she was facing. Her mother would later say that Raa seemed quieter in those final months, but not in a way that raised alarm. She seemed tired, her mother recalled, as if she were carrying a weight she could not name. On the evening of March 28, 2017, Raa spoke to her family on the phone. The conversation was unremarkable. She talked about her classes, mentioned that exams were coming up, and said she was preparing dinner. Her mother asked if everything was okay, and Raa said it was. There was no indication of distress, no hint that anything was wrong. That was the last time her family heard her voice. The next morning, March 29th, began like any other in the women's dormitory of Rajshahi Medical College. Students woke up, attended prayers, and prepared for classes. Raa's roommate, Sirat, noticed that Raa had not left her room by mid-morning, which was unusual. Raa was typically punctual and did not skip classes without informing someone. Sirat knocked on the door. There was no response. She called Raa's name. Still nothing. At this point, Sirat became concerned. Raa was known for being considerate about letting others know if she planned to be out or if she needed privacy. Silence without explanation was out of character. Sirat looked through the door's peephole, and what she saw made her scream. Raa was hanging from the ceiling, a scarf tied around her neck and looped over the chandelier. Sirat's scream brought other students running. A small crowd gathered outside the door, but it was locked from the inside. Several students forced the door open by slamming their shoulders against it. They rushed inside, and according to their accounts, the scene was eerily calm. The bed was neatly made. A frying pan sat on the stove with food partially cooked. A knife and chopped vegetables lay on the counter. Everything suggested that Raa had been in the middle of preparing breakfast when something happened. But what exactly was not immediately clear. The students attempted to cut Raa down, but it was too late. Her body was cold to the touch, indicating she had been dead for some time. The college administration was notified, and they, in turn, contacted the police. The first officers arrived within an hour. What happened next would become one of the most controversial aspects of the case. The police did not secure the scene properly. Students who had discovered the body were allowed to walk freely through the room. Some of them touched objects, moved furniture, and handled items that might have contained evidence. In any standard forensic investigation, the first priority is scene preservation. Investigators photograph everything before anyone is allowed to enter. They document the position of the body, the placement of objects, and any signs of disturbance. But in Rajshahi, none of that happened. By the time forensic officers arrived, the scene had been compromised. This would later make it nearly impossible to answer basic questions. Had anyone else been in the room? Were there signs of a struggle? Had anything been removed or rearranged before police arrived? The lack of proper scene management was not just sloppy police work. It raised questions about whether investigators were genuinely interested in determining what happened or whether they had already decided on an explanation before the evidence was examined. The initial police report, issued the same day, concluded that Raa Atif had died by self-harm. There were no signs of forced entry, the report stated. The door had been locked from the inside. The scarf used in the hanging belonged to Raa herself. Therefore, police reasoned, she must have acted alone. But that conclusion ignored several troubling details. First, the door being locked from the inside did not necessarily prove anything. Many doors can be locked from the outside with the right tools or techniques, especially older doors with simple latch mechanisms. Investigators did not test whether the lock could be manipulated from outside, nor did they document the type of lock in their report. Second, The absence of a note was unusual. Studies of self-harm cases suggest that a significant percentage of individuals leave some form of written explanation, especially when the act is premeditated. Raa left nothing, no letter, no text message, no social media post hinting at distress. Third, the scene itself suggested routine, not finality. She had been preparing food. Her bed was made. Her belongings were organized. These were not the actions of someone who had decided that morning to end her life. They were the actions of someone who expected the day to continue. Finally, there was the matter of Raa's behavior in the days leading up to her death. Friends who spoke to her in the week before March 29th said she seemed fine. She was studying for exams. She had made plans to visit her family during the next break. She had posted on social media just days earlier, sharing a photo of herself smiling. None of this fit the profile of someone in a state of acute despair. But the police report did not engage with these inconsistencies. It presented the case as straightforward. A young woman overwhelmed by personal problems had made a tragic decision. The college administration echoed this narrative. Within hours of Raa's death, the institution issued a statement expressing sorrow, but framing the incident as a private tragedy with no broader implications. The message was clear. This was not the college's problem. It was Raa's. Raa's family received the news from a phone call from the college administration. They were told that their daughter had died and that the cause appeared to be self-harm. Her father, Raa Atif, immediately made arrangements to travel to Bangladesh. By the time he arrived in Rajshahi, Raa's body had already been moved to a morgue and an autopsy had been scheduled. Muhammad demanded to see his daughter. When he did, what he saw did not match the official story. There were marks on Raa's neck, but they were not consistent with what he had expected. He later described them as deep, irregular bruises that did not look like the kind of marks a fabric loop would leave. He also noticed small injuries on her hands and what appeared to be broken fingernails, signs that suggested she might have struggled against something or someone. He asked the attending physician about these injuries. The physician said they would be documented in the autopsy report. But when the report was released, it made no mention of any signs of struggle. Instead, it stated that the marks on Raa's neck were consistent with self-inflicted hanging and that there were no indications of foul play. This was the first of many official documents that Raa's family would come to distrust. The autopsy was conducted by a government medical examiner in Rajshahi. The report, dated April 1, 2017, concluded that Raa died from asphyxiation due to hanging. The examiner noted ligature marks on her neck, but stated they were consistent with a fabric loop tightening under the weight of a suspended body. The report mentioned no defensive wounds, no signs of violence, and no evidence of forced restraint. But the family noticed something strange almost immediately. The police and the autopsy report both claimed that the marks on Raa's neck were birthmarks, not injuries. This explanation was baffling. Raa had been a model. Her face, neck, and shoulders had been photographed countless times for magazines, advertisements, and social media posts. In every image, her skin was flawless. There were no birthmarks, no discolorations, nothing that matched the marks described in the police report. Photographers who had worked with Raa confirmed this. So did her parents, who had known her since birth. The claim that these marks were pre-existing was not just inaccurate, it was absurd. Yet it appeared in the official documents, and no one in the investigation seemed interested in correcting it. This was the first clear sign that something was deeply wrong with the way the case was being handled. It suggested that either the investigators were incompetent or they were deliberately misrepresenting evidence. Muhammad Atif refused to accept the autopsy's conclusions. He hired a private forensic consultant to review the findings. This consultant, a pathologist with decades of experience, examined photographs of Raa's body and reviewed the autopsy report. His conclusions were starkly different. The ligature marks, he argued, were inconsistent with hanging. In a typical hanging, the mark left by a fabric loop forms a diagonal line across the neck, rising upward toward the point of suspension. But the marks on Raa's neck were horizontal, encircling the throat in a way that suggested manual strangulation or ligature strangulation applied while she was in a different position. The consultant also noted that the autopsy failed to mention several key details. There was no reference to petechia, tiny burst blood vessels in the eyes that are common in cases of asphyxiation. There was no mention of saliva or froth around the mouth, which often appears when someone dies from hanging due to the body's reflexive attempts to breathe. And there was no explanation for the injuries on Raa's hands, which suggested she had been trying to defend herself or remove something from her neck. The consultant's conclusion was unambiguous. Raa's death was the result of forced strangulation, not self-harm. Someone had choked her, and the scene had been staged to look like a hanging afterward. This finding directly contradicted the official autopsy, and it placed the investigation in an entirely new light. If the consultant was correct, then Raa Atif had been murdered. And if she had been murdered, then someone was responsible, and the authorities were either ignoring evidence or actively covering it up. Mohammed Atif took the consultant's findings to the police. He demanded that the case be reopened and that investigators conduct a proper forensic examination. The police response was dismissive. They insisted that the original autopsy was accurate and that there was no reason to doubt the conclusion of self-harm. They pointed to the locked door as proof that no one else could have been involved. They cited the absence of forced entry. They repeated the same points over and over, as if repeating them would make them more convincing. But Mohammed was not satisfied. On April 10, 2017, he filed a formal complaint with the Rajshahi police, accusing Sirat Parveen Mahmood, Raa's roommate, of being involved in his daughter's death. The accusation was based on several factors. Sirat was the last person known to have seen Raa alive. She was the one who discovered the body, and her behavior after the incident, according to Mohammed, raised serious questions. He claimed that Sirat had been evasive when questioned by the family, that she avoided making eye contact, and that she refused to provide clear answers about what had happened the night before Raa died. Mohammed also pointed to something else, the deletion of digital evidence. In the days following Raa's death, her family tried to access her social media accounts. They knew her passwords and had permission to check her messages, hoping to find some clue about her state of mind in the hours before she died. What they discovered was disturbing. One name had been removed from Raa's following list on Instagram, Sirat Parveen Mahmood. Every other contact remained in place, but Sirat's account had been unfollowed. The change had occurred after Raa's death, meaning someone had logged into her account and made the alteration. The family had not done it. Raa obviously could not have done it herself. So who had? A few days later, Raa's entire Instagram account disappeared. All her posts, all her messages, all her photos, gone. The account was not deactivated. It was deleted entirely, as if it had never existed. The family contacted Instagram's parent company, requesting that the account be recovered or that records be provided showing who had accessed it and when. They received no response. The Rajshahi police were informed of the deleted account and asked to investigate. They did not. They made no attempt to recover the data, no request to Instagram for login records, no examination of IP addresses to determine who had accessed the account after Raa's death. The deletion was dismissed as irrelevant. But for the family, it was the opposite. It was evidence that someone had deliberately tried to erase Raa's digital footprint, possibly to cover up communications that might reveal what had happened in her final hours. Under mounting pressure from Raa's family and a growing number of activists who had begun following the case, the Rajshahi authorities agreed to exhume her body and conduct a second autopsy. On April 24, 2017, less than a month after her death, Raa's grave was reopened. A new team of medical examiners, including 3 independent specialists, was brought in to examine her remains. The family hoped that this second autopsy would confirm what the private consultant had found and force investigators to reopen the case. But when the report was released, it said almost exactly what the first one had. Raa Atif died from asphyxiation due to hanging. There were no signs of violence. There were no indications of foul play. The independent specialists who had been brought in to add credibility to the process did not issue a dissenting opinion. They signed the report, effectively endorsing the conclusion that Raa had taken her own life. The family was devastated. All the evidence they had gathered, all the inconsistencies they had pointed out, all the questions they had raised, none of it seemed to matter. The second autopsy was supposed to be a chance for the truth to emerge, But instead, it felt like a repetition of the same narrative, rubber-stamped by a different set of officials. At this point, the police offered a new explanation for why Raa might have harmed herself. According to investigators, Raa had been in a romantic relationship with a young man named Shahi. They claimed that the night before her death, she and Shahi had spoken on the phone, and during that conversation he admitted to being unfaithful. The revelation supposedly devastated Raya, leading her to end her life the following morning. This explanation was presented as the missing piece that made sense of everything, but the family immediately rejected it. Raa had never mentioned anyone named Shahi. Her parents, who spoke to her regularly, had never heard the name. Her friends in the Maldives said the same. Raa was not secretive about her social life. If she had been seeing someone, people close to her would have known. More importantly, there was no evidence to support the claim. Police said they had found messages between Raa and Shahi, but they never produced these messages. They said there were phone records showing calls between the two, but they never released those records. The family requested copies of the data. Their request was denied. The police insisted the information existed, but said it was part of the investigation and could not be shared. This was another pattern that would repeat throughout the case. Authorities making claims, but refusing to provide evidence to back them up. With no charges filed, no investigation ongoing, and no acknowledgement that anything other than self-harm had occurred, the case was officially closed in late April 2017. Sirat Parveen Mahmood was never arrested. She was never charged. She was never even formally questioned in a way that her answers were made public. The college administration expressed sympathy for Raa's family, but took no responsibility for what had happened. The Rajshahi police issued a final statement summarizing their findings and closed the file. For the authorities, the matter was settled. For Raa's family, it was just beginning. Muhammad and Raa Atif refused to let the case die. They filed appeals with higher courts in Bangladesh, arguing that the investigation had been inadequate and that the evidence pointed to foul play. They contacted international human rights organizations, hoping that external pressure might force a re-examination of the case. They gave interviews to journalists, both in Bangladesh and abroad, explaining why they believed their daughter had been murdered and why the authorities were covering it up. But the responses were always the same: no grounds for review. The legal system offered no avenue for the family to pursue justice. The case was closed, and under Bangladeshi law there was no mechanism to reopen it without new evidence. But the family argued that new evidence already existed. It had simply been ignored. The independent forensic consultant's findings, the deleted social media account, the lack of any credible motive for self-harm. All of it, they insisted, should have been enough to warrant further investigation. It was not. Years passed, and Raa's story continued to circulate in certain circles. Activists in Bangladesh who focused on women's rights and judicial reform began using her case as an example of systemic failure. They pointed out that young women in conservative environments often faced enormous pressure to conform, and that when something went wrong, authorities were quick to blame the victim rather than examine the circumstances. Some argued that Raa's death was not an isolated incident, but part of a broader pattern in which women who defied social norms were punished, either through violence or through the erasure of their stories. Others were more cautious, saying that without definitive proof of foul play, it was impossible to say for certain what had happened. But even those who hesitated to call it murder acknowledged that the investigation had been deeply flawed. The failure to secure the scene, the dismissal of forensic inconsistencies, the refusal to investigate the deleted social media account, these were not minor oversights. They were failures that undermined any confidence in the official conclusion. Raa's parents continued their fight, but as time went on, it became clear that they were unlikely to see justice in their lifetimes. The legal system in Bangladesh did not offer them a path forward, and international organizations had limited ability to intervene in domestic cases. What they could do, and what they did do, was keep their daughter's name alive. They spoke about her in interviews. They maintained a social media presence dedicated to her memory. They framed her story not just as a personal tragedy, but as a cautionary tale about what happens when institutions fail to protect the people they are supposed to serve. Raa Atif's legacy is complicated. To some, she is a victim of a conservative society that could not tolerate a young woman who lived independently and pursued her ambitions without apology. To others, she is a symbol of the flaws in Bangladesh's criminal justice system, a reminder that forensic standards and investigative rigor often take a back seat to convenience and political pressure. And to her family, she is a daughter whose death remains unexplained, whose story was never fully told, and whose justice was never pursued with the seriousness it deserved. The case never received the kind of forensic scrutiny that might have answered the central question: was Raa Atif murdered? The evidence that might have resolved that question was either lost, ignored, or deliberately destroyed. The authorities who were supposed to protect her failed at every stage, from the moment the police arrived at the scene to the moment the case was closed. And the community that should have demanded answers chose instead to accept the simplest narrative, the one that required the least discomfort and the least introspection. Raa's story is not unique, but it is particularly haunting because of how visible she was. She had been photographed, interviewed, and admired. People knew her face. They knew her eyes. And yet, when it mattered most, no one in a position of authority was willing to look closely at what had happened to her. Her parents believe she was killed because she refused to conform, because her independence made her a target in an environment where independence was seen as a threat. Others believe the truth is more mundane, that she was the victim of a crime, possibly committed by someone close to her, and that the investigation was botched through incompetence rather than malice. But either way, the result is the same. A young woman died under suspicious circumstances, and no one was held accountable. The photograph that made Raa famous, the one showing her standing in the ocean with her gaze fixed on the camera, continues to circulate online. People still share it, often without knowing her story, captivated by the image of a young woman whose beauty seemed almost otherworldly. But those who know what happened to her see something different in that photograph now. They see a young woman who wanted to become a doctor, who tried to navigate a world that demanded she be less than she was, and who died in a locked room with a scarf around her neck while breakfast sat cooling on the stove. They see a case that was never solved because the people who could have solved it chose not to try. And they see a family that will spend the rest of their lives asking questions no one in authority wants to answer. Raa Atif's story does not have a conclusion because it was never allowed to have one. It ends in silence, in bureaucratic refusals, in closed files and deleted accounts. It ends the way too many stories like it end, not with justice, but with a quiet insistence that justice was never necessary in the first place.